Back in 2018, I made a video called Free Child Abduction Cases. This was a collaboration with a channel named Merc. In this video, I talked about 3 separate cases, one of which being James Bulger. At the time, I briefly reviewed his case and explained it in limited detail. Back then, I wanted to create a more detailed video, but I just didn't get around to it. Today, I changed that. With that being said, let's move on to the video. Warning. Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. It's hard to believe that people are evil from the start. You assume that all children are pure, innocent, and kind, but sadly, that just isn't the case. Monsters can come in many forms, and in today's case, we talk about that. James Bulger was 2 years old when he was beaten to death. Hours before his murder, he was with his mother at a shopping centre. James let go of his mother's hand while she was paying for shopping, and he went exploring. In that moment, 2 10-year-old boys led James out of the shopping centre by hand. From there, he was brutally murdered. This case is remembered in history of how depraved humanity can be, and shows that even with the most innocent and kind people, there is evil hidden everywhere. Today, we cover the James Bulger case. Let's begin. On the 16th of March 1990, James Patrick Bulger was born in Liverpool, England. He was 2 years old when he was murdered, but in those 2 years, James made everyone smile, including family and friends. Sadly, he was killed and the bright light was snuffed out. On the 12th of February 1993, James and his mother named Denise Bulger went to the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle. Denise had James with her as the pair went shopping. Around 3:40 p.m, the two entered A.R. Tim's butcher shop on the lower level of the centre. At some point, Denise let go of James while she paid for shopping, and within a minute, she turned around to find her son was gone. This was the last time she saw her son alive, and 27 years later, she still regrets letting go. While Denise paid for shopping, James's curious mind wanted to explore. As he wandered the shops, 2 10-year-old boys named Robert Thompson and John Venables approached the 2-year-old. They grabbed James by the hand and guided him out of the shopping centre. This moment was caught on CCTV at 3:42 p.m. Within 2 minutes, James last saw his mother and was led out of the New Strand shopping centre by his killers. The image you are currently seeing is the last image of James. Let's go back a bit. Robert and John both ditched school in the early morning and went to the shopping centre James would later be abducted at. As the day went on, the 2 boys were seen stealing various items such as lollies, toys, some batteries, and a can of blue paint. Some of these items were later located at the crime scene. As the boys stole items, they were seen casually observing children and apparently selecting a target. Later on, one of the boys confessed to police that they were planning to find a child to abduct, lead him to a busy road alongside the shopping centre, and push the kid into oncoming traffic. Within the hour James had disappeared, the shopping centre's security was notified and started a search within the premises. The police was also called in, but no one had seen what happened to the toddler. Denise was taken to the police station where she stayed overnight while investigators searched for the boy. While the search was on, Robert, John and James walked to the Leeds and Liverpool canal, which was a quarter-mile away from the shops. While at the canal, the boys dropped James on his head, which gave him an injury to the face. The boys joked around and threatened to push James into the canal, and around the same time, an eyewitness said he saw James crying his eyes out. The boys were seen by 38 people, but most bystanders did not intervene. 2 witnesses did question John and Robert, but the pair claimed James was their brother or that he was lost and they were taking him to a police station. At one point, the boys took James into a pet shop where they were told to leave. Sometime later, the boys arrived at the village of Walton. This was about a 33-minute walk from the shopping centre James was abducted from. Facing the boys was the Walton police station. Robert and John hesitated for a bit before leading James up a steep bank to a railway line near the Walton railway station. This is where they started to torture the 2-year-old. At this point, I will be getting into some graphic details which may disturb some viewers. If you wish to skip past this point in the video, please forward to the time shown on screen. One of the boys threw a paint can which they had shoplifted into James's left eye. They kicked him, stomped on him, and threw bricks and stones at him. During the torture, they put batteries in his mouth, and according to police, they may have inserted some batteries into his anus, although none were found there. From there, they dropped a 10-kilogram or 22-pound iron bar described as a railway fishplate on James. He sustained 10 skull fractures from the iron bar striking his head. A pathologist that worked on the case at the time stated that the toddler had suffered so many injuries that none could be isolated as the cause of death. It didn't take long before James succumbed to his injuries. After he died, John and Robert laid him across the railway tracks and weighted his head down with rubble in hopes a train would hit him and make his death look like a tragic accident. After hiding the body, the boys left and went on with their lives. James remained hidden in the rubble until being discovered by some schoolboys 2 days later on the 14th of February. Sadly, he was found cut in half and unrecognisable from a train that passed by. A forensic pathologist testified in court that James had died before the train struck him. Police suspected that there may have been a sexual element to the crime, as James's socks, shoes, pants and underwear had been removed. In the pathologist's report that was read out in court, they found that James's foreskin had been forcefully pulled back. When Robert and John were questioned about the aspects of the attack, the pair were reluctant to give details and denied inserting batteries into James. As the years have gone by, John has been questioned, and as of now, he has given no account to any sexual element to the offence. As the investigation proceeded, police quickly found the low-resolution video images of James's abduction from the New Strand shopping centre by 2 unidentified boys. The railway embankment where the body was located was soon flooded with hundreds of flowers from the community, and one boy was detained for questioning but was released by police. Not long later, the boy and his family had to flee the city due to threats by vigilantes. A breakthrough to the case came when a woman recognised herself on an enhanced image of the 2 boys on national TV. She recognised John as one of the boys that had skipped school with his friend that day. The witness contacted police and the boys were soon arrested. Due to the fact that the suspects were so young, this shocked the investigating officers. Early press reports and police statements had referred to James being seen with 2 youths, suggesting the teenagers were killers, as the ages of the boys was difficult to identify from the blurry images from CCTV. Forensic tests confirmed that both boys had blue paint on their clothing, which was also found on James's body. Both also had blood on their shoes, and with DNA testing, this confirmed the blood was James's. There were also shoe imprints on James's right cheek, which matched the shoes worn by the boys. This proved that they had used at least some force and that they were both complicit. In police custody, Robert asked whether the 2-year-old had been taken to hospital to, quote, get him alive again. John Venables and Robert Thompson were each charged with the murder of James Bulger on the 20th of February 1993. As the trial proceeded, the media referred to the killers as Child A, which was Robert, and Child B, which was John. Up to 500 protesters gathered outside the court where the boys were being held for their initial court appearance. Robert and John's parents were moved to different parts of the country and assumed new identities after receiving multiple death threats from vigilantes. The full trial occurred at the Preston Crown Court on the 1st of November 1993. Both boys denied the charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction. The reason there was an attempted abduction charge was because on the same day Robert and John abducted James, they also attempted to abduct another 2-year-old boy at the same shopping centre. The mother was nearby and was able to intervene and prevent the kidnapping. Both boys sat in view of the court in raised chairs so they could see. They were accompanied by social workers, and even though they were separated from their parents, they were allowed in touching distance when their families did attend the trial. Media reported the attitude and behaviour of the accused as the trial proceeded. Later on, these aspects were heavily criticised by the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled in 1999 that they had not received a fair trial by being tried in public in an adult court. At the trial, the prosecution successfully refuted the principle that a young child cannot be held legally responsible for their actions. This meant that Robert and John could be tried for what they did. Robert and John were considered by the court to be mature enough to understand what they did was seriously wrong. A child psychiatrist interviewed the boys before the trial, and as a result, it was learned that both John and Robert knew the difference between right and wrong. The child psychiatrist also said in court that Robert was suffering PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, after the murder of James. The boys didn't speak during the trial, and a large part of the case was the 20 hours of tape-recorded police interviews. Robert was considered to have taken the leading role in the abduction process. However, it was John who suggested the idea of taking James up to the railway line. Later, John described that James seemed to like him, holding his hand and allowing him to pick James up. A solicitor named Lawrence Lee later said that Robert Thompson was one of the most frightening children he had ever seen, and it is said that after his appearance in court, John stripped off his clothes, saying, quote, "I can smell James like a baby smell." As the trial went on, the prosecution admitted a number of items which could be seen by the court. These included James's underwear, a rusty iron bar, a blood-stained stone, and a box of 27 bricks. The pathologist spent 33 minutes explaining the injuries James had sustained. It was found that many of these injuries to his legs had been inflicted after he was stripped waist down, and it was stated that brain damage was extensive and included a hemorrhage. On the 24th of November 1993, John and Robert, now aged 11, were both found guilty of James's murder. They had become the youngest convicted murderers in the 20th century. The judge ruled that the boys should serve a minimum of 8 years in jail. After the trial ended, the judge lifted reporting restrictions and allowed the public to know the names of the killers, saying, quote, "I did this because the public's interest overrode the interest of the defendants. There was a need for an informed public debate on crimes committed by young children. People have criticised this decision as it has created problems from that point on." After the trial, it was recommended that the two boys should serve a minimum of 10 years in prison instead of the 8. This meant that John and Robert would be eligible for release in February 2003, at 20 years of age. A campaign was formed in hopes of extending the prison sentence, and after receiving 280,000 signatures, the campaign was successful, and in July 1994, it was announced that John Venables and Robert Thompson would be kept in custody for a minimum of 15 years in prison. This meant that they wouldn't be considered for release until February 2008. By that point, they would be 25 years old. After the trial, Robert was held at the Barton Moss Secure Care Centre located in Manchester. John was held at the Red Bank unit located in St Helens. These locations were not public knowledge until both boys were released. The details of the boys' lives were recorded twice a day on a running sheet and signed by a member of staff. John and Robert were taught to conceal their real names and the crime they committed. The boys received education and rehabilitation despite initial problems, and both boys also had their parents visiting often at the places they were held. During the years, it was reported that Robert and John suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. John in particular told his family and guards that he was experiencing nightmares and flashbacks of James's murder. Sometime in June 2001, after a 6-month review, the parole board ruled that the boys were no longer a threat to the public and that they could be released. A few weeks later, both John and Robert, now adult men, were given new identities and moved to secret locations under a witness protection style program. They were given national insurance numbers, qualification certificates, medical records, and passports. However, there were terms for their release. They weren't allowed to contact each other or James's family. They were prohibited from visiting certain areas of the region, and a curfew could be imposed on them at any time. They also had to report to a probation officer. If they were to breach any of the set out rules or be seen as a risk to the public, they would return to prison. An injunction was imposed on the media after the trial, preventing the publication of the details about John and Robert, and the worldwide injunction was kept in force following their release on parole. This meant their identities and locations could not be published. The injunction was granted because there was a very strong and very real possibility that John and Robert's lives would become at risk if their identities were to be known. Since 2001, there have been multiple times people have been arrested, fined, and sentenced to jail. These reasons vary, but here are some. On the 27th of November 2013, a man from Liverpool received a 14-month suspended prison sentence for posting images on Twitter claiming to show John Venables. On the 25th of October, a man was jailed for 26 weeks for stalking Denise Bulger. He had previously been warned by police in 2008 for a stalking. In March 2012, a 26-year-old man was arrested for allegedly setting up a Facebook group entitling it "What Happened to Jamie Bulger Was Effing Hilarious." The man's computer was seized for further investigations. On the 13th of March 2019, an actress named Tina Malone was given an 8-month suspended prison sentence for posting John Venables' identity on Facebook. On the 26th of April 2013, 2 men received suspended jail sentences of 9 months after admitting to contempt of court by publishing photographs which they claimed to be of John and Robert on Facebook and Twitter. These posts were seen by 24,000 people. The public has been made aware that the internet users are also subject to the law of contempt. On the 14th of July 2016, a woman was jailed for 3 years after sending Twitter messages to James's mother, in which she posed as one of the killers and his ghost. The sentence was later reduced to 2.5 years on appeal. And honestly, there are more, but I'll move on from here. If you try to find their identities or where they live, it can land you in jail, as they are protected by a worldwide injunction. So my advice is not to go looking unless you want to end up on the list you see in front of you. There isn't much on Robert after he left prison. From what I found, he hasn't reoffended since he was released when he was 18. In 2021, he would be 39 years old, and in 2006, there were reports claiming Robert was in a stable gay relationship. It is believed that this relationship is long-term and his partner knows his real identity. That's pretty much everything on Robert, so I'll move on to John now. There is much more information on John compared to Robert. Shortly before his release in 2001, when John was 17 years old, it's alleged that he had sex with a woman that worked at the Red Bank secure unit where he was held. These allegations were outlined and the female was accused of sexual misconduct and she was suspended. She never returned to the Red Bank and John started living independently in 2002. Not long later, he began a relationship with a woman who had a 5-year-old child. It's not known whether John had already begun downloading child pornography at this stage, though he denied even meeting the child. In 2005, when John was 23 years old, his probation officer met his new girlfriend, who was 17 years old. After a number of young girlfriends, it was thought that John was having a delayed adolescence. Sometime later, there was a reduce in supervision, where John began excessively drinking, taking drugs, and downloading child abuse images, as well as visiting certain areas of the region he wasn't allowed to. In 2008, he had a new probation officer. The new officer noted that John was spending a great amount of time on the internet and playing video games. In September that year, John was arrested for fighting outside a nightclub. He claimed he was acting in self-defense, and the charges were eventually dropped after he agreed to go to an alcohol awareness course. 3 months later, he was found to be in possession of cocaine. He also broke curfew on 2 occasions, and he had revealed his identity to a friend. As a result, on the 2nd of March 2010, John was back in prison. Reports state that John had returned to prison because of a serious allegation. On the 21st of June 2010, John was charged with the possession and distribution of indecent images of children. It's alleged he downloaded 67 images of children over a 12-month period to February 2010. During the 12 months, he had allowed others to access the files through a peer-to-peer network site. Because of this, John faced 2 charges under the Protection of Children's Act 1978. John appeared in court via video link where he was only seen by the judge hearing the case. He pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. After the court hearing, it came to light that John had posed in online chat groups as a 35-year-old lady named Dawn Smith, a married woman from Liverpool who boasted about abusing her 8-year-old daughter. John hoped this would get him additional child pornography. Let's rewind a bit. In February 2010, John contacted his parole officer, fearing that his identity had been compromised at his place of work. When the officer arrived at John's house, he found him trying to remove or destroy a hard drive of his computer with a knife and a tin can opener. The officer saw this as suspicious, so the hard drive and computer was taken away for examination. This led to the discovery of the child pornography, which included videos and images of children from 2 to 8 years old. John was eligible for parole in July 2011, but on the 27th of June the parole board decided that he would remain in custody and would not be considered for parole for at least another year. On the 4th of May 2011, it was reported that John would once again receive a new identity, following what was described as a serious security breach. Details of the breach could not be reported for legal reasons, but from what I found out, the incident occurred after a man posted photographs on a website devoted to identifying pedophiles, and John was on this list. On the 4th of July 2013, the parole board approved John to be released, and on September the 3rd, 2013, he was a free man again. He wasn't free for long, however, because on the 23rd of November 2017, it was reported that John had yet again been recalled to prison for child pornography. The Ministry of Justice declined to comment on these reports, and on the 5th of January 2018, he was charged for unspecified offences relating to indecent images of children. A month later, John pleaded guilty to these charges, where he was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in jail. In September 2020, he was denied parole. On the 4th of March 2019, James's father Ralph lost a legal challenge to lift the lifelong order protecting John's identity. The judge turned down the request, saying there was a strong possibility that if his identity were to be exposed, it would end in possibly fatal consequences. 2 months later, in late June 2019, there were reports stating the British officials had been considering relocating John to either Canada, Australia or New Zealand due to the high costs behind protecting his identity. In response to the media coverage, the New Zealand Prime Minister remarked that John would need an exemption under the Immigration Act and that he shouldn't bother applying. As of September 2021, this is all the reports on John and Robert. If we learn more information at a later date, I will make an update video. I feel really bad for James's family. They've spent the last 30 years knowing that their son's killers have been given so much protection to keep them safe, even though James was killed. John and Robert are disgusting people. I don't even know if you can class them as people. Robert seemed to learn his lesson and stay hidden, but John just kept getting worse and worse, and I'm not too sure how you can do that after you murder a 2-year-old. The case shocked the world back in the 1990s and is still discussed today. I only hope that the families have moved on and remember James as he was. With that being said, this is where this case ends. If you liked the video, please let me know. I would appreciate any and all feedback. All sources I used are in the description below, and with that being said, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.